So, good morning, everyone. In this report, I'll be discussing John York's insights and findings on the five-act structure and the importance of change in protagonists. So, a brief introduction is when Aristotle was the first one to write about drama. So, he was the first person to have written plays back in ancient Greece. So then he only has three segments, which was the beginning, middle, and the end. So it's like the three-act structure. However, Horace first articulated and modeled the idea of a five-act structure in which he laid out principles in his treatise Ars Poetica. So that was like when the first century was going to end. So John Benson was the guy who assimilated the idea of Horace five-act structure. So meanwhile, Terence and Shakespeare practiced these structures into their plays, with or without knowing about it. So the five-act structure or the dramatic narrative was used with great success, especially in Shakespeare's plays, since he usually has a five-act structure written and dramatized. So first of all, the differences between the two-act structure is the first one was detailed refinement. Since the three-act structure is just three acts, which is the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution. So five-act structure merely just added more details into the second act of the story. So basically, the first and the last acts remain the same because it's just the setup and the resolution of the play. It's just the same. It has the same beginning and the same ending, but it's just the middle act that had more details that were being refined. So, because it's how the tension rises and falls in that particular scene, and the predicament of the characters kind of like changes. So, number two, both forms can be traced back historically. So, of course, I mentioned before that Aristotle was the first one to have written a play, while Horace devised the five-act structure. Plays were originally from Greece and yeah, they're both like historically connected to each other. And so the third part is five-act structure was added or inserted two more act breaks in the second act of the traditional Hollywood paradigm, which I will show a diagram from York's book in the next slide. So if you've noticed from this diagram, they added more breaks in the second act and adding more details that could lead to the protagonist's growth or demise in his journey. So basically, they inserted a rising action and denouement during the second act. So, but York asks, how does this structure help us understand stories? So, according to Thomas Baldwin, a scholar who studied Shakespearean act structure, he said that from the first use of the five-act structure, all the plays tracing back to Terence had a similar underlying shape. So, and if you can see this like in this fifth slide, um, here is a detailed reasoning of Baldwin in understanding the five-act structure. So the first act structure is the preparatory information. It's about details of the protagonist and the setting. The second act presents the actions being performed before the battle or the conflict. The third act is when the conflict started, and then they fought and won. The fourth act is when the antagonist counterattacked, and then the protagonist and other characters aren't sure if they've won or lost. And so lastly is like the five act is when they really won officially. Because so to summarize, Baldwin answered the question that the five act structure helps us understand the story because the plays are simply just constructed into five clear cut stages, which already explains us what will happen to the protagonist and how the story progresses. So yeah. John Benson also mentioned that Seneca's plays were clearly constructed into five arcs, that similar to Shakespeare. So the plays by Seneca was like the main factor why it was kind of popular in England. which then opened or connected to the structural musings of Horace to the current literate generation. So there have been a lot of arguments whether later editors had tampered on the original structure or not. But what's most important is that the first pattern found in Terence's stories were also found in Shakespeare's plays. So it's kind of like the five act structure is dominant. So even if Shakespeare refuted or didn't know anything about the five act structure, his play still has the same shape that's really very common to the five act structure. So like here, centuries had passed, and in 1863, a German playwright and novelist named Gustav Freytag had developed a newer five act structure that is commonly used today to analyze classical and Shakespearean dramas. So he was like the first person to codify Terence's pattern, which appeared in Elizabethan drama. That was like before he noticed or he studied Shakespeare. So basically, the underlying shape goes like this. You can see that it's basically the structure that we learned back in high school: the exposition, complication, climax, falling action, and the catastrophe or the resolution. So exposition is when the time and place was established, the conflict and dramatic tensions. Complications is the interesting, in the interests have clashed, each character's intrigues have been spawned and stuff. So it's when the tensions have built up. The conflict is when the climax is when the conflict has reaches its highest point, leading to either victory or defeat. The falling action is basically like the consequences of Act 3. It could be like they were heightened by false hopes, or like the antagonists have counterattacked which they did not expect at all. So the resolution is when the conflict is finally resolved. So yeah, that's basically it, and the character has transformed into someone who's new. So although although Freytag can be a bit confusing with his definitions, but it was actually him that articulated about a moment that's significantly important in dramas nowadays, and it's called the midpoint. Midpoint is the moment something profoundly significant happens. So it means that it is the moment when the protagonist experienced a life-changing moment. For example, in Titanic, the ship hits the iceberg, so that is the midpoint, because that's basically the moment that would change the lives of Jack and Rose and every passenger on the ship. Another is Hamlet, where he becomes certain of Claudius' guilt, which is when the midpoint started, like how Hamlet's mindset had changed, knowing that fact that Claudius had something to do with his father's death. So, Christopher Booker, in his encyclopedic exploration of storytelling, the seven basic plots, argue that all stories could be broken down into five distinct sections. So there are five stages, paraphrased by John York, which is exactly the same pattern we've noticed earlier. This is just the same. So what happens if we apply these stages to an act? So it will basically like oversimplify the information or even leave some details out. However, Booker's pattern actually fits the Shakespeare act form, which is what really matters. So it's like, for example, the Romeo and Juliet play. This is how the midpoint plays out, and it's used as the dramatic arc of the entire play or drama. So actually, it's not just Shakespeare plays or any classical plays that have this form. Even the current films and the TV series all have five dramatic art, or the five art structure. So Hollywood movies aren't really a five art structure, but it's really like for York, it's really beautiful how these three act films can easily become a five act form. So the midpoint is an extremely important moment in every drama. So at some point, Carly Kaufman mistakes content for form, because he stated that the classic structure was simplistic, and it was like he was saying that it's obvious that the structure was just something that's available to work with. However, York refuted, saying that art is something we can find order and balance in. So even famous abstract expressionists find shape within chaos. It's the same with plays and stories, because five act structure shows us the underlying journey of the characters, not just for the plot as something we can just simplify. So it brings us to to these three questions. First is, why then is three act structure ubiquitous? So ubiquitous. Ah, so so this mimic York answered that it basically just mimic the shape of the larger structure. The three-act structure do not need to control the middle section of the play or story. Most convenient reference point to start from. So the three-act is everywhere because it's like it's how do you say, it's like a summarized version of the larger structure, and there's no need to control the middle section since the rising action, conflict, and denouement were already given in that arc. So it's convenient because it's much easier to create a play with just a three-arc structure because it serves as the summed up outline to the entire play. That's why the three-act structure was like very common these days, especially in today's generation. So the second is five-act structure was the dominant theatrical form for over 2 centuries. So what made it so? So first of all, there was a huge demand for frequent breaks. Sorry. So because there was some plays or dramas that before that has a chorus in each act or a small break during the second act. So in a way, these breaks help frame the story. So five-act structure was really dominant because it gives the drama more tension before beginning the next act. And there's a sort of adrenaline and excitement in each act because each act has a turning point or a reversal plot twist. So for the third question, if five-act structure really was so important, what led to its demise? So the three-act structure, when used wisely, imposes a much stronger structure. It creates regular gripping turning points that increase narrative tension. So five-act structures tend to dull out the scenes and they drag the plot, which can be inconvenient. So it's why the three-act structure is very common these days due to its jointed and easy to follow story flow. But it's nothing to like mock the five-act structure because the five-act structure also helps us see the underlying patterns of every story. So then this leads us to the second part of the report, which is the importance of change, like what every character needs. So according to York, change is thus inextricably linked to dramatic desire. If a character wants something, they are going to have to change to get it. So I mean, change is something that the characters want, so it is deemed as a dramatic desire because it helps the character realize that they need to change in order to claim what they desired. So, a good example is the film A Few Good Men, where the main lead was Lieutenant Coffee, which was played by Tom Cruise. So, Lieutenant Coffee was a spoiled, smug, and very superficial character. His desire was to bring a powerful army chief to court for bullying a recruit to death. So his desire for justice is the dramatic point in the story. And he must change into a mature man in order to face that army chief to court. So like he really needed to change to succeed with his justice. So we have here like Walter White from Breaking Bad. So it's a very enlightening series. He's the anti-hero protagonist where he explained how everything in life changes, from molecules to elements to electrons. So everything changes, and the main point is that that's how life works. Things change, they decay, and then they transform into something else. So basically, life is the study of change, and change is the bedrock of life. It's the same with stories because the character needs to change so they could transform into someone they needed to be to achieve their desires. So a lot of movies like has this. Every film has this. Like the protagonist's need for change because of something that happened. So, characters who change due to their wants, like stories, they change has patterns too. So we will discuss about the change paradigm in the roadmap. As you can see, the acts actually show the characters' progression into their change. So how do they change, or how will they change? So the roadmap of change looks into the underlying pattern and observes how the protagonists overcome their flaws slowly. So they will learn of their flaws and they will learn to accept it, which brings us to the next slide. So the paradigm illustrates um, the learning is central to every three-dimensional story. That is how the characters change. So, and it's when their unconscious flaws have surfaced and how they act on their flaws. So, acting on their flaws brings change and transformation of the protagonist, which they learn to overcome. And then we have Christopher Vogler, a young script analyst at Disney who created a structural model on a monomyth. So monomyth is also known as the hero's journey. Basically, a monomyth means a hero who goes on journeys, encounters battles, winning it, then came back from their mysterious battle to return home. So York said it's flawed and simplistic, but further analyzing it, he learned that it helped him open to key elements of structural designs found in change. So here, Vogler's model consists of 12 key stages. York had dismissed these key stages because he thought that it was the same as Freytag's pyramid about how the biggest drama lies in the middle act. So, like, to conclude this part, this is very long. So, the essence of the stages are nothing more than just a three-act structure viewed from the protagonist's perspective, because it is their change after all. So, mostly it's in the perspective of the protagonist. So, going back to the importance of the midpoint in change, why does this exist at all? So, why does the midpoint exist? So, midpoint in the change paradigm corresponds to the moment of big change. So, it's not because it is the most dramatic scene out of every act, but it focuses more on the supreme significance of that particular midpoint scene. So, it's in that scene that we consider as supreme significance because it's when the protagonist changes for the better. That's the main focus and not the drama itself. So, basically, the protagonist always starts as someone who was new and unaware, but when an outside party alters their everyday mundane life, the protagonist will acquire a want or need to fix it. So, hence their ultimate transformation at the ending. So, it's usually in the midpoint where something profoundly significant happens to the protagonist, which then leads to the importance of change as the story progresses. So, midpoints occur simply too often to be coincidences. They're not. Understanding their true significance unlocks a door, behind which lies the reason stories are the shape. Reason stories are the shape they are, which is which is like quoted by York. So stories are shaped by our understanding of the midpoint scene and how it profoundly changes the life of these protagonists. So like that's basically the main point of the importance of midpoint as a factor of change in these protagonists. So yeah.